So in reviewing my notes for this section, I noticed that I didn't cover a couple things that I want to cover. So I'm going to cover those. I'm going to add a little bit that I thought of in the days since I made the last video. And I'm going to start with, in the last video, I said maybe I should make a list of all the ways we're lying to ourselves. And I did that, not all the ways. There's hundreds of biases that psychologists believe exist in each human, or most humans. But I just grabbed my favorite. Some of them come from the article I posted called The Top 20 Ways You're Lying to Yourself, and others just come from other podcasts and things I've written and all over the place. So I'm going to start with one I covered before in one of these videos called Fundamental Attribution Error. That's when I make a mistake and I made a mistake, but someone else makes a mistake that affects me and I attribute it to their character, usually a stranger. Kind of an offshoot of that is called self-serving bias. That's where I see myself in a much more positive light than I see other people. In-group, out-group bias is where I tend to gravitate towards people that are like me and to be suspecting of those not like me and tend to attribute negative qualities to them and positive qualities to people like me. Projecting is a psychological term when we take something that exists inside of us and we project it into other people. It's one of my favorite defense mechanisms, actually. An example that comes to mind for projection is for the last couple days and through the weekend, I'm going to be grading papers of dream interpretation as one of the classes I teach. And a lot of times I'm reading the paper and I'm like, where did they come up with this? And chances are it's because it's something similar that is happening to them and they project it onto this person's dream and write that as their interpretation. They don't even see that it's coming from them. They feel, they really are convinced, if you read the papers, that particular interpretation is accurate of this other person when it's actually them. Egocentric bias is to see the world. It's kind of what I demonstrated with the paper in the last video. That's where we see the world through our own lens and we believe everyone sees the world the same way as we do. Halo effect is when I see someone that's attractive and I attribute other positive qualities to them, like intelligence or creativity and so forth. And horn effect is the opposite, where I think someone's unattractive and I attribute other negative qualities to them, like maybe that they steal or they lie or they do other negative things. Doppelganger bias is when it's a tendency to trust people that look like people I've trusted in the past. Stereotype effect is when a person believes a stereotype about themselves, then they make that happen, basically. So one of the areas of this is a study where I think it was women are reminded that women aren't good at math, which totally is not true, actually. But it used to be believed to be true a lot of years ago, and some people still believe it to be true. If you remind women of that, the group that's reminded that women aren't as good at math, or any other ethnic group, any kind of ethnic group, they tend to do worse than a group that wasn't reminded of the same, matching group. Backfire effect is when you try to convince someone of a different perspective and they dig their heels in and believe their perspective even more. And one that's related to that is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you only see the evidence that confirms what you believe. Negativity bias is that the brain is negative bias due to evolution. It's more efficient for our brain to focus on what's negative than on what's positive. So the brain is negative bias. Illusion of control is another I have written here. That's where we tend to create patterns. This is another evolutionary bias. We tend to create patterns where patterns don't exist. We tend to blame ourselves because that's better than believing the world is a chaotic place where harm might come to me. Instead, I blame myself for making a mistake. Affective forecasting was some studies were done where people were asked about preferences and how they would continue to prefer that specific thing in the future, and they're wrong. And the studies, and it's related to another one that I have written, belief we can predict how we will be in the future. We're really bad, humans are really bad at predicting how they're going to be, how they're going to feel, how they're going to behave in the future. Confabulation I covered in one of the other videos also, where we create stories. There's some really great studies on that. And in fact, I cite several examples in the top 20 ways you're lying to yourself. Because confabulation to me is what we're doing all the time. We're creating reasons rather than knowing, because we're incapable of knowing the actual reason of why we're doing what we're doing. And then, as I said in the last video, the memory not being trustworthy. And I actually had in my notes to cite that podcast with Julia Shaw, You're Not So Smart, the episode with Julia Shaw. So that's what I have for that. So what's the purpose of this? I know we're running long. I said in the last video a few days ago that the goal is to loosen our attachment to our thoughts. And that is the goal. But another way of saying that comes from one of my favorite books, probably a book I've recommended more than any other book that I've ever recommended, called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. In that book, one of the biggest lessons I took from it, and there were a few, there's a bunch of lessons, but the ones I remember the most, there's a few, and probably the one I cite the most is creating doubt. And creating doubt is all of this. Like, I am probably enacting some of these biases. I am probably not seeing things the way they really are, and I just need to create doubt about that. The other thing that was in my notes that I wanted to cover related to this is, so where does that leave us, right? Like, if I can't trust my mind, then what do I trust? And that can lead to a sense of ambiguity, right? Like, I don't know what's real or what's not real. And of course, that would be an extreme, right? But at least when I'm arguing with somebody, I have to be able to step back, create doubt, and live with ambiguity that I may not know the exactly what happened. And an example I give of this all the time, and I send a podcast to some of my clients that have to live with ambiguity, is about a woman who there's the possibility that false memories were implanted about her mother abusing her. It's also possible her mother abused her. And she's in her 40s, I think, at the time of the podcast, and she's never gonna know. Like, she's had therapy. Other experts have said the therapist probably implanted false memories, or maybe her dad led her that way because it was a custody battle. But the bottom line for this woman is she's never gonna know if she was abused or not. And she has to live with that ambiguity. And we, as humans, if we start creating doubt in our thinking and lessening our attachment to our beliefs and our thoughts, we are also going to have to live with ambiguity. And humans aren't good at that, generally speaking. We don't like ambiguity. We like knowing. We like feeling secure in our knowledge and in what's going to happen in the future. Our brains are predicting machines, a lot of evolutionary theorists say. They're always trying to predict what's going to happen next based on what's happened in the past that's similar. So ambiguity is not something the human mind is comfortable with. Yet, in this beginning to become a Buddha class, that's where we end up here. And we have to learn to just try to be present to cope with that. The one other thing that I wanted to put out there, and I know this is a very long video at this point, is one of the things I do with my students, and one of the things I believe helps people recognize how their mind lies to them, is to commit to some change behavior for a period. In my classes, I usually use about 2 weeks. In this case, you can choose whatever you like. But what I would like some of you to do, if you want to do it, you don't have to, but if you want to see how your mind lies to you, commit to a change. Commit to maybe exercising, like positive changes, maybe meditating. So commit to a change, and then watch how your brain over the course of the period, whatever period, set yourself a period, 2 weeks, a month, whatever you want to set. Over the course of that, try to watch and monitor how your brain tells you don't have to do it. You don't have to work out. You don't need to exercise today. Whatever it is, pay attention to how your brain is lying to you, and then exercise control over your mind by doing it anyhow, by doing what you committed to. That is, to me, mind control. Good luck, and I hope some of you are on the Facebook page and can talk about that. All right, thanks. I just wanted to say, if you want to learn more about these biases and how we don't see the world the way it is, I highly recommend the podcast, The Happiness Lab. It starts off with all these ways our brain thinks these things will make us happy, and they don't. Okay, actually sometimes the opposite makes us happy. So the whole, there's only 2 seasons of it. It's a pretty new podcast, started maybe in 2019. Okay, so there's 2 seasons. Highly recommend that. The You're Not So Smart podcast, the whole idea of that podcast is also how we lie to ourselves. And then one other one would be The Hidden Brain, and there is a lot about how we deceive ourselves.